But so, hey, everybody, thank you for tuning in. And I'm super excited to talk with Ryan Andrews from RyanDandrews.com, who is an author, has written for several really prestigious platforms, and probably what's most familiar with most of you guys is that he has written for the Alan Aragon Research Review as well, which is something that probably most of my listeners are familiar with. And Ryan has put out a lot of good work about concerning the sustainability of what we put into our bodies, which is food. So, and this is something that I've been interested in for a long time, and Ryan is the first person to actually talk about this. So with that, Ryan, thank you so much for joining me for this call. And how are you doing?
Yeah, Abel, thanks for having me on. I'm doing really well. I'm excited to chat. I mean, you were just telling me about some of your listeners and some of the other guests you've had on. And my roots in the nutrition world are really in fitness and bodybuilding. That's where I started in my teens. So I have a soft spot for that area, and I always kind of have an ongoing interest in that area for sure. And like we'll talk about over the years, I kind of have evolved a bit in my thinking and how I view food. But yeah, I love the fitness, bodybuilding, nutrition world. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, cool. So maybe let's start there. So you mentioned that that's how you started, and then you kind of evolved further from there. So how did you get into the whole fitness and nutrition kind of game? How did that start for you?
Yeah, it started when I was about 14 years old. My first class in high school was a weightlifting class, and I was immediately hooked just from day one. The idea that I could change how I was living and lift weights and do exercise and change my appearance was uncharted territory. My family wasn't, a health-minded family or anything. So it was revolutionary for me and very powerful. And I went on to do some of the things that a typical exercise bodybuilding junkie does. I got the Arnold Schwarzenegger Encyclopedia for Christmas and started buying supplements at GNC and accumulating protein powders and learning more and reading muscle magazines and all that stuff. And I went on to compete about 10 times before I turned 20 years old. So my teens were really all about competitive bodybuilding. Right. And when I made it to college, I started studying nutrition and exercise and learned that I could potentially work in this field. And I went on to graduate school and continued my studies and became a dietitian. And throughout all of those years, I was getting, I guess, further away from kind of the bodybuilding world, and the curtain was pulled back in terms of looking at where food comes from during graduate school for me. So there was just kind of this gradual shift of looking at food and saying, all right, what are the macros? How's it going to benefit or influence my body composition and health? And there was a shift to looking at a food and saying, all right, how is this food choice going to influence everything else? Farm workers, animal welfare, soil health, water pollution, all the other things that there's a ripple effect from our food choices. So that was a gradual evolution that occurred throughout my schooling and my early 20s. And it's really become my main area of focus over the last several years, the whole sustainable eating idea.
Right. So yeah, just like I mentioned to you before we started recording, is that originally I just wanted to have someone on who is knowledgeable about the topic of nutrition and sustainability, and someone recommended you as a guest. And before that, I wasn't familiar with your work, and I just saw that you've written about farming practices and how to save the planet by how we eat. And then I started Googling after you more thoroughly, and then I realized oh wow, this guy was actually really serious about fitness, and still is into fitness. So it's really cool to have someone who is involved with both sides of nutrition. And so obviously when someone is involved with bodybuilding and body composition oriented kind of eating, then as you said, it's all about macros, and it's all about how food is going to influence how we look and how we feel. But how did that shift occur? I mean, you mentioned that you started learning about what goes into food production and all of that stuff, but did you start to first care less about your body and what food does with your body, or did the sustainability side of things become so important that it just simply outweighed your concerns about bodybuilding and fitness?
Yeah, there were a couple things that happened that were pretty that shifted my course in terms of how I viewed things, that were kind of an overnight change, and then some other things that have just been kind of very gradual shifts. For example, I think I was 22 years old. So, 14 years ago now, during graduate school, I was taking a course about ethics in using animals in research. And it was just a required course, and so I was going through it. And the more I learned about using animals in research, it just got me thinking more about, I didn't feel very comfortable about using animals in certain types of experimental research. And so I was talking to a lab assistant one day, and then she brought up the idea of eating meat. And I had never thought about food in that way before. I always just had my unit of chicken, and it was X grams of protein. And so I remember that day quite clearly when I was 22, and she kind of brought that question up just in a very innocent way. And I forever have looked at food differently from that point. So my gateway into it was just kind of thinking about animal welfare, but then the curtain was pulled back, and I started considering everything about where our food choices, or how our food choices influence everything else. So like I mentioned, not only animal welfare, but farm laborers and their welfare and how they get paid and their well-being, and then soil health and what chemicals are applied to soil and farming practices. So in my late 20s and early 30s, I really started to shift from spending a lot of my time in the fitness world to spending my time on sustainable farms and helping out there and learning more about it and talking to farmers and going to conferences and helping with nonprofits that do food waste recovery and things like that. So there were a couple, like I said, big shifts in my life, but a lot of the other things have just been gradual discoveries and accumulating new knowledge and talking to people. And it just felt like a whole world that was kind of hidden from me. It was something I had never thought about for 22 years. And then all of a sudden I was thinking, gosh, food comes from somewhere. So this is really important. We need to start thinking about this and talking about this.
Yeah, and actually it's funny that you mentioned that, because one thing that I was just really impressed when looking into your work and just listening to podcast episodes that you appeared on is that a lot of people will come across to information like you came across at that time, but just simply the way that a lot of people communicate these concepts. When I look at vegan, vegetarian YouTube vloggers and things like that, it's just that it's almost like this scary, sometimes for lack of a better term, almost sociopathic tone that they're so offensive or defensive, just so kind of aggressive that turns a lot of people away. And maybe you were kind of luckier at the time that someone could communicate these things to you in a way that didn't turn you off. But what do you think about the way that general communication about these issues is happening in kind of common media? And just to finish my thought, one thing that was impressive about your approach is that your way of talking about these things is just so calm, so non-defensive, so non-aggressive, that I think it does a lot of service to people in kind of facilitating more open-mindedness about these issues, I guess.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I spent many years working with a company many of your listeners are probably familiar with, called Precision Nutrition. And we still do a lot of online coaching. And so I think my ability to kind of communicate in a way that's maybe a little more calm and brings up important questions and allows people to kind of be introspective about their own lives probably comes from my experience in just generally coaching people in nutrition. And I don't believe that really getting in somebody's face and telling them they're wrong or what to do or you have all the answers, I don't think that is effective for helping people discover new things. Plus, I think it's kind of arrogant to say that. Nobody has all the information or all the answers about everything. I haven't read every journal article or every book or talked to every expert. So I try to be kind of humble in my approach and realize that I don't know everything, and I'm always discovering new information and talking to new people who have a different perspective. So I appreciate your kind words. I see certain people that definitely turn me off in how they communicate information about food and eating. And yeah, what I like to just bring things up and get people hopefully thinking, and importantly, listen to people as well. You know, people are juggling a lot when it comes to food choices and nutrition changes. You know, we have cultural traditions and taste preferences and budgetary concerns and family dynamics and all these things we're juggling, and then our own health and body comp and things like that. So there's a lot that we have to think about every day when it comes to our nutrition. And when you add in these really big picture things like environmental health and farm worker welfare and animal welfare, it becomes a lot. And some people are ready to take it on and they feel empowered, and other people feel kind of crushed under the pressure. So, yeah, I'm always looking how I can best help people and communicate these issues.
Right. And so before we actually get into the more specific questions, let's just start with, you know, for people who are solely viewing food as a means of altering or manipulating their body composition, which is probably the majority of my listeners, which is already, I guess, more awareness than the average person has towards food, because the average person is just eating food as a means of for pleasure or just to sustain their body. But if we had to give like a pitch for why is it worthy to actually look at food not just as a means of benefiting ourselves, but also benefiting the planet, what do you think is the benefit of having that outlook and mindset?
Well, first let me say I do think that people who are already considering their own health and body composition, I mean, that's huge. Not a lot of people are doing that. So adding on maybe another level of consideration with food, I think people in the fitness community are primed and ready to go because they already care to a certain degree. So I first want to say that. But gosh, I mean, I think that body composition is one thing to consider, obviously, but I don't think it's exaggeration to say that our food choices influence everything else. You know, a few years ago, if somebody said, "Hey, Ryan, yeah, your food choices, they influence everything else in the world, the food choices you make every day," I would say, "Hey, slow down. That's an exaggeration. That's unrealistic." But I do believe now, the further I get into this world of sustainable nutrition, that the food choices we make every day have a huge ripple effect in the world. And I've already mentioned a few of those areas, and they spread far and wide. You know, animals and farm workers and soil health and water pollution. I mean, these things are absolutely huge. I mean, to the future of a sustainable place to live. So whether your listeners have kids or grandkids they're concerned about having a nice place to live, or people just have a general concern for future generations, our food choices play a major role into that. And so, yeah, I think anybody who cares about body comp and health, and they say, "Gosh, you know, why should I even consider this?" To say it, you know, kind of bluntly, our food choices influence everything else. So it's a big deal.
In terms of having an influence on things, a big kind of ongoing debate, not just when it comes to nutrition, but anything environmentally related. So be it recycling or just littering, anything like that. There's always this big debate in terms of what actually produces big results. Is it the top-down kind of approach where we target governmental actions and policymaking and those kinds of things? And where does the individual's not just responsibility, but the overall impact that we can even hope to achieve by targeting individuals and people who are listening to this podcast or podcasts much bigger than this? It's always a big kind of dilemma whether it's worthy even to target individual people, because ultimately people are just so fallible in terms of they have their day-to-day struggles, and we can only expect so much of them to do out of their own goodwill. So where do you kind of stand on this? Do you think it's worth targeting the average person with this?
I do. I think there are benefits to both approaches. The top-down approach in kind of shaping the path for people, I do think is useful in certain aspects. I mean, some people would argue and say, hey, leave me alone. I want the choice to do whatever I want to do. There shouldn't be any, rules or laws or taxes or anything like that around foods. And I don't know if I have a hard stance on that. I think whether we like it or not, I mean, there are things in place every day that help to shape the choices we make, whether it's a tax or a advertising campaign. But yeah, I mean, advertising, I think, is actually a huge area that we're influenced by that we don't really fully grasp. But yeah, beyond the top-down approach, I do think it's worth it to inform people and empower people. I mean, a lot of people just have zero awareness about food and where it comes from. I mean, I've been starting to work with more and more kids, and when you ask kids why food choices matter, the good news is that many of them will say health, and that's good. It's good that they understand the connection between what they put in their body and their ultimate health. But very, very, very few, if any, will say soil health or water pollution or greenhouse gas emissions or animal welfare. Like, there's just people aren't connecting the dots between what they choose for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and all of these other big picture things in the world. So I do think it's worth it to talk about it, educate people about it, whether it's in schools or on podcasts or writing articles for blogs or newspapers or magazines. Because for me, I mean, I always look back to my upbringing. I was somebody who cared a lot about nutrition, and I didn't think about anything beyond my own body composition when it came to nutrition until I was 22 years old. And I was somebody who was going to university and becoming educated, and it still wasn't being talked about. So I do think it's an area we can spend time on. And I think for people who are ready to take in the information, we'll take it. And if they're not, and that's okay.
So when looking at nutrition and sustainability, what would be like a good place to start? Like, what are some of the big rocks, the low-hanging fruits that we can address, or that the average person who is willing to commit to at least some effort to actually orient their nutrition in a direction where it's actually having a beneficial impact on the planet's sustainability. What are some of the big rocks that are worthy to mention, that are relatively low effort and big return on investment? Yeah,
I love this question. I spent several years really trying to immerse myself, like I said, in the world of sustainable nutrition. I still do, whether it's helping on farms or reading journal articles or talking to nonprofits who do food waste recovery or anything. And I really tried to go into this exploration with an open mind and come away with exactly what you're asking about. And at this point, I think the top three things that have a really, really big influence on environmental sustainability with our food choices are, number one, finding your kind of minimal dose needed of animal foods. So I guess eating more of a plant-based diet, whatever you want to call it, it's going to be different for everybody, how many animal foods they include. But that is a huge one. And number two is getting clear on how much food you are wasting, because wasted food is another really major issue that I don't think a lot of people are thinking about. And wasted food, I mean, there's kind of the obvious downside of wasted food where if you throw food away, you are really throwing away all the resources that went into producing the food. But the other bummer is that when you send a food to the landfill, it goes to the landfill and it releases very potent greenhouse gases, most notably methane. And that's really, really bad news for the future of the planet. So food waste is another one. And the third one is trying to buy food, no matter what food it is, from farms that are incorporating more sustainable practices. So a shorthand here in America is it's called organic food. Now, organically grown food doesn't solve all the problems of sustainable food production. They can still incorporate practices that aren't the best. However, the goal of organic food production tends to be more of a sustainable model to keep soil healthy in the long term. So that's a nice shortcut in America, is to buy organically produced food. Locally grown foods in America often are closer towards the organic end of the spectrum. So locally grown foods can also be good. And those are really the big three. I mean, if somebody wanted to tackle one of those or all, or two, or all three, getting more of a plant-based diet, whatever that looks like for them, getting clear on how much food they're wasting, especially at home, because we waste a lot more than we think, usually about 25% of all the food we purchase at home, and then trying to support farms that are incorporating more sustainable growing practices.
Right, excellent. So let's maybe tackle these one by one. So let's start with that probably most people kind of expected, which is the animal product question. What is the general kind of couple of key bullet points? Like what is generally problematic about consuming large amounts of animal products? What makes animal product consumption an unsustainable practice in general?
I should also mention, these are very complex issues, so it's always tough to kind of bring it down to a sound bite and say, well, here's the takeaway. But I'll do my best to kind of make it digestible for the listeners. So the big thing with animal product consumption is think about inputs and outputs. So to produce animal products, whether it's meat, dairy, eggs, it requires a lot of inputs. So inputs, I mean growing feed for these animals, water intake for the animals, upkeep of the animals. There's a lot of inputs that goes into producing animal foods, and you don't get that much beneficial stuff back out. So you do get a concentrated source of protein and calories in the form of meat, milk, and eggs, but the conversion isn't very efficient of all of the inputs to the useful outputs that you get. So it's kind of an inefficient conversion of resources. So that's a big part of it. The other part is livestock production in general is responsible for about 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So that's, if you think of all human-generated greenhouse gases, 15% are specifically from our production of livestock. So it's a big chunk, and that's just livestock production. The other part of animal product production is water use. So, water consumption to produce animal products is very large, and it's not usually for what people think. A lot of people think, well, animals drink a lot of water. Well, yes, they do drink a lot of water, but a lot of it is to water the feed crops that are grown to feed the animals, which these feed crops are extremely water intensive. And then finally with animal products, it's waste production. So a small amount of waste from animals, whether it's urine or manure, is not a problem. It can actually be quite useful on smaller integrated crop livestock farms where they can utilize that waste, and it can help to build soil fertility and grow other plants, and that's great. But what we run into right now is just there's such a high concentration of animals in small spaces that there's just too much waste, and it's leading to a lot of nutrient pollution. So too much phosphorus, too much nitrogen is being lost in this waste, and it's going into waterways and polluting lakes and oceans, and it's even entering the atmosphere in certain cases, which can lead to nitrous oxide pollution, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. So those are some of the big ones with animal foods and livestock production. You want me to just keep rolling and talk a little more about food waste and sustainable farming?
I just want to interject. Actually, I have two questions in my head regarding animal food consumption and animal husbandry. So one kind of counter argument that I tend to hear about this is the ecological need for animals, for soil health, and just to keep an ecological balance between, all the food chain and herbivores, omnivore, or carnivores and all of these animals that we need. And if we were to eliminate these animals from farmlands, then it would cause ecological problems. So what do you think about this argument?
I agree. I agree with that argument. And livestock can be extremely useful, not only environmentally, where if they are appropriately grazed and managed in the right way, they can help to rebuild ecosystems and conserve water and even sequester carbon in the soil. So they can be very environmentally friendly. And then in certain parts of the world, livestock are important for labor on farms. They're a source of food security, converting inedible vegetation into a concentrated source of calories and protein. So I definitely think livestock can be a sustainable and very useful aspect of farming. I think what we're running into right now is that our demand for animal products is so high with our growing human population that it's really becoming tough to produce animal products in a sustainable way. We're becoming dependent not on these sustainable, farms that we're talking about doing these healthy, long-term sustainable things. Those type of farms can't really sustain the demand that we're placing on them. And for example, I think one of the statistics that always jumps out to me, in America we eat about 223 pounds of meat and fish per person per year. And if you compare that to our bean intake, for example, another nutrient-dense food that's a good source of protein, we only consume about 7 pounds of beans per year. So, even bringing something like that more into the balance, where maybe you're eating closer to 100 pounds of meat and fish per year and more like 100 pounds of beans per year, that decrease in meat consumption might allow these more sustainable farms to proliferate and become the norm. Instead we are reliant on CAFOs, which is concentrated animal feeding operations. And these are the farms that are putting a lot of animals in a small space and growing feed inefficiently, and there's too much waste pollution. And so I think that's what leads to the problems that we see a lot with animal products.
Right. So for my bodybuilder and body composition concerned listeners, and I am one of those as well, who, these people generally consume at least like 100 to more like 150 grams of protein per day. And for them saying that, well, just don't consume that much protein, people in the fitness world, that's just not going to happen. So, what would you advise for them? Like, what would be, do you think that is achievable while being generally environmentally sustainable with your nutrition?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think exploring some other ways to get to that protein goal you have each day, I think it's worth exploring those things. So whether it's, having lentils or beans or something for one of your meals and keeping meat or eggs or whatever else you use at your other meals and kind of seeing how that works out to get to your protein total. I think that's an easy swap. So maybe one meal a day, trying just another plant, a concentrated plant source of protein like legumes. Protein powders, I think, are another easy switch for people. So most people I talk to tend to use more of a dairy-based protein or even an egg-based protein, and swapping over to like a legume-based protein like peas, or there's even like hemp-based proteins. That can be another easy swap if you're doing shakes every day, like post-workout or something. And another consideration is what type of meat you eat. And what I mean by that is I remember I was working with one guy he was a large bodybuilder eating a lot of animal products, and his solution was to work with a local farmer and buy essentially like half of a cow. So that was his meat for I don't know how long it was, 6 months or a year, something like that. But so instead of relying on a bunch of different animals produced in unsustainable ways, he found the most sustainable local farmer and essentially purchased half of a cow. So that's how he was working to, decrease his environmental footprint. So I think there's a lot of things to explore. And then even within animal foods, considering maybe a little bit less meat and more eggs, because eggs are quite a bit more efficient in terms of the inputs and outputs that goes into producing eggs. So you could say, hey, maybe I'll have eggs a couple more times a week instead of so much meat, or something like that. I think there's a lot of different avenues to explore.
Yeah, and actually, touching on factory farming for a second, I remember I actually had this argument repeatedly with different people that I always said that factory farming is pretty much definitely in the Western world, at least, it's kind of the 21st century equivalent of like Holocaust or something. I mean, it's just outrageous what's happening there. I mean, maybe that's a nasty way to explain it, but it really is quite unbelievable if you think about the magnitude of the scale at which it's happening and the brutality of the day-to-day suffering of those animals. And I've always said that meat should be basically a luxury product that not everybody can afford, but that would make it possible to produce meat in more sustainable ways. And the counter argument for that was that it would be unethical because then it would make high protein food less available for people, and for kids that are growing and things of that nature, it would just be problematic for human health, and that's just not ethical. But I mean, for the average person who doesn't even require that much protein, it would actually be totally doable with a lot of plant products and just maybe a small amount of eggs, some dairy, and just a much smaller amount of meat. Would you agree with that?
Oh, completely. I mean, obviously, people who are going through intense bouts of training have increased protein needs, so it can be a little bit more difficult to hit that total. But yeah, I think for the average person who's not going through any type of training and just maybe eating to support their existing, body and base health, I definitely think it's doable to hit protein goals and other nutrient goals with a mostly plant-based diet. And like you said too, I mean, you hit it exactly on the nail on the head. I mean, when you talk to pretty much anybody, nobody wants to support factory farming conditions that are inhumane for animals. So I think if we can start to buy foods that support farms that are doing it the right way and raising animals in a humane way, and then supporting plant-based foods like beans and nuts and seeds and things like that, and just making those more of the norm, I think, that's a good thing. If we can decrease our reliance on those factory farms, that's going to be a good thing for animal welfare, for environmental sustainability, for farm worker welfare, and probably for our own health in the long term. So I think there's a lot of benefits to transitioning.
So, I mean, there would be obviously a lot more stuff to talk about in terms of animal product consumption, but maybe we should touch on the other key points that you mentioned. So organic farming and food waste were the other two. Want to elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little bit with food waste. We waste a lot of food, and the figure in the United States is about 25% of all the food we purchase for our home is thrown away. And we might forget about it in the fridge, or we don't save leftovers, or various factors can dictate why we throw the food away. But yeah, 25% of all food we purchase. So if you have 4 bags of groceries and you're coming home from the store, one of those bags is going to end up in the landfill. And food that's sent to the landfill is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. If you add up all of the greenhouse gas emissions from food that's sent to the landfill, it's actually the 3rd largest greenhouse gas generator behind the United States and China. So if it was a country, if you were representing food waste as a country, it's the 3rd largest source of food waste. So, 3rd largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big deal. We're not just talking about a few, random emissions of methane here and there. It's a really big thing. And I also mentioned how when you throw away a food, all the resources that went into growing the food, whether it's water or chemical inputs like fertilizers or pesticides or energy consumption to transport the food, that's all essentially wasted when you throw away the food. So food waste is a really, really big deal. And the good news with that one is I think people in the fitness world are already familiar with some of the strategies to decrease this one, especially at home, which is getting some base level meal planning for your week. That can be really helpful. And getting comfortable with using leftovers is another really big one, which I know a lot of people in the fitness world are. They live on leftovers. And another big thing to consider with food waste is being willing to buy vegetables and fruits that aren't visually appealing. So the ugly produce. A lot of produce that doesn't look a certain way at the store, people don't buy it. You know, if they see an apple, it doesn't look how an apple should look in their head, they don't buy it. And ultimately the grocery store has to discard that produce. Maybe they throw it away. Hopefully they donate it, but they might throw it away. So being willing as a consumer to buy some of the visually unappealing produce items can be a big step to take at the grocery store, at the farmer's market, because most likely it has the same nutrient value. It just doesn't look the same. So that's food waste. And then the other, I mean, probably even more complex than livestock production is sustainable farming and how that influences the planet. The goal of organic farming, I brought that up earlier, is to keep soil healthy in the long term. And soil is a really big deal. I mean, soil is the food's nutrient source. You know, all the foods that we grow and buy at the grocery store, their original nutrient source is the soil they grow in. So if soil is depleted and not full of nutrients, we're not going to be able to grow nutrient-rich foods and sustain healthy populations. So we need to keep soil healthy, and sustainable farms, they try to keep soil healthy. And a lot of conventional farms can incorporate practices that deplete soil health. So they might rely on burning, they might do monocropping, they might use a lot of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, they might do a lot of tilling. So there's a lot of things they might incorporate that just deplete soil. So over time you're left with none, or just soil that isn't beneficial in any way. So the flip side of that is sustainable farms, where they incorporate all sorts of practices like minimal tilling. They might use animal waste in a way that can build organic matter over time. They use composts and green manures. They might utilize crop rotations and grow a variety of foods. So there's a lot of things that sustainable farms can do to keep soil healthy in the long term. And I mean, along with that is the whole world of pollinators too. So a lot of the practices that benefit soil benefit pollinators, and we need to keep pollinators around for our food supply. If we eliminated pollinators off the planet tomorrow, all sorts of things would go into disarray, but about 30 to 40% of our food would be gone because they're dependent on pollinators, and we need to keep them healthy as well, along with soil. So yeah, finding out if there are any sustainable farms in your area, whether it's organically grown or something similar, that's a really, really big deal, because those are the farmers we want to support and hopefully make more accessible and normal. And I think that's really going to be the future of food, is those kind of sustainable farmers.
Right. The only question I have about organic farming is that some counter arguments that I've heard is that organic farming practices, because they use less pesticides and things of that nature, they require much larger spaces to actually facilitate plant growth than conventional farms. So on the net balance, it's actually less environmentally friendly. Have you heard that argument?
I have. And a couple of thoughts about that. First off, that tends to only happen early on when a farm shifts to organic. So if there's a conventional farm and it transitions to organic, in the first several years, it might fall into that category where you need a lot more land to produce the same amount of food, which isn't the most efficient thing ever. However, longer term, so beyond the first few years, as you start to help to kind of rebuild the soil and make it more productive, you can eventually have a plot of land that is equivalent to a plot of organic land that's equivalent to a plot of conventional land in the long term. So I do think that's true, but only in the short term. And I think long term, I don't think that argument holds up as well. Plus, I mean, getting very big picture with it, you get into some other big questions about sustainable food production for a growing population. So let's say, for example, that it does take a lot more land with organic production to produce the same amount of food. Well, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think it's only really an issue when you have to grow more and more food for a skyrocketing population. So I think we just have to kind of start to ask ourselves, what is the upper limit of population that the planet can handle? Because if it's kind of like going into credit card debt or something. I mean, in the short term, sure, we can feed a lot of people with conventional farming, grow a lot of food, feed a lot of people. But if it's only sustainable for a very short period of time, I mean, and we eventually have to pay off the debt, then that doesn't seem very sustainable to me long term. So I think it's a valid point to consider. I don't, as far as I know, I don't think it holds up long term for farms that switch. And then I do also think it just brings up some other kind of deeper questions about the upper limits of the planet and how many people we can sustain and under what type of, growing and farming conditions.
And do you have any kind of proposed solution for that issue?
No. The only solution I would propose at this time is, again, I think it's starting to think about these things. I mean, if we're not thinking about them and the population just continues to skyrocket. I mean, last time I checked, there are about 218,000 new mouths to feed every day on this planet. So that's a rapidly growing population. And, I'm definitely not one to say, well, we need to put a cap on how many kids people should have or anything else. I don't think that's necessarily effective, but, just thinking about the role we play on the planet and to future generations and what is most sustainable and that type of thing. So starting to think about it and learn more about it and try to make choices that feel good for you and your set of values.
Right. Cool. And, we actually almost went on for an hour, and there would be actually a lot more stuff to talk about. We didn't even touch on, for example, seafood, didn't touch on some ethical, kind of questions, ethical dilemmas. For example, the consistency of your ethical views, not yours specifically, but just of a person's in general. So, for example, if someone is against meat consumption but is consuming dairy or eggs, or if someone is entirely vegan but is wearing clothes and things like that made of animal products. So how consistent do we need to be? These are all super interesting ethical questions. And I don't know, maybe someday we could talk again. Maybe we could set up a debate or some kind, someone who holds the opposite views on organic farming or something. That could be interesting. But maybe as a last question, I'm curious, how do you personally eat? Are you as a person interested in fitness and also sustainability? How do you eat personally?
Yeah, before I answer that, I would love to have a part two of this. There are so many other topics I think we could chat about, and
yeah.
I love that. I like the idea of bringing up counter arguments and other ways to think of it too. Because like I said earlier, I mean, I don't have all the answers, and I'm always looking to take in more information and reconsider my point of view. So I think that would be cool. We should do a part two. So
awesome.
In terms of how I eat, my diet doesn't fit neatly into one category as well as it used to. For many years, it was pretty much 100% vegan diet. I would say if somebody followed me around right now and looked at what I was eating, it's a mostly vegan diet. And I mean, getting into more details with that, I try to really emphasize some of the more environmentally efficient food groups. So those are things like tubers and roots and legumes. I try to really eat a lot of those food groups. So tubers, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and roots like carrots and beets and parsnips and things like that. and the whole legume food group, lentils, black beans, chickpeas, all those things, those are some of the most environmentally friendly foods to produce. So I try to really eat a lot of those. I try to go easy on tree nuts, so almonds, walnuts, pistachios, cashews, those kind of things. Those can bring up, especially conventionally grown. Tree nuts can be problematic to the environment, and I don't think building a diet around those foods as a calorie source is very environmentally friendly. So I try not to go crazy with tree nut intake. But yeah, so every so often I'll have some eggs. I try to get pasture raised eggs. Same with dairy. I try not to make it a staple in my diet. Yeah, some of those are, I guess, some of the foundational things I do with my diet.
Awesome. Do you consume any kind of protein supplement or anything like that?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I go in phases. I'll do it a lot in my shakes, and then I kind of take a break for a while. But I do. I love protein supplements. I've been using them since I was about 14 years old. I try to look for either like a pea protein or hemp protein, or like a blend or something like that. There's plenty of brands now that produce those kind of protein powders, and it tastes pretty good too. So yeah, I like those.
Right. Awesome. Cool. Then, Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time. This was really awesome. And then, yeah, we will keep in touch on potentially bringing together a part 2. That would be awesome. And I think the listeners would love it too. So maybe just mention people where they can find you or any kind of resource that you want them to check out. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, the most up-to-date information you can check out on ryandandrews.com. It's my website. I got a free ebook there if you want to check it out, and that has all my social media links. And I have a bunch of different articles and a certification I helped write with Precision Nutrition, so you can probably find something I did on precisionnutrition.com.
Hey guys, I just want to tell you again that your inputs for this podcast will help it grow more than anything, and your requests, ideas, and comments will contribute to awesome content going live on this channel and podcast more than anything. So if you want to contribute, the best thing you can do is to go on Facebook and look up Sustainable Self-Development. You'll find both the page and the Facebook group that is dedicated to discussions and ideas being thrown around. Go there and note down your comments about what kinds of topics or guests you want to be featured on this podcast and YouTube channel in the future. Just keep in mind the general theme of this podcast and my YouTube channel, which is to help people becoming their best selves in terms of lifestyle as it pertains to fitness and general personal development. This podcast is really dedicated to self-improvement, both physically and mentally. So keep that in mind. So thanks again for tuning in, and see you next time.